The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, and founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service, DC Report. His most recent book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And before we go any further, I want to point something out to our listeners. David K. Johnston identifies neither as a Democrat nor a Republican. He comes to us, as he does with all of his reporting and his writings, in a completely nonpartisan manner. David K. Johnston, thank you for joining us and welcome back to the program.
Well, Jim, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure to speak with you again. And we do have a lot of ground to cover here, not surprising given the state of our world right now. So let's start with Trump's taxes, something you're quite familiar with. It's been several weeks now since the New York Times dropped its bombshell report that Trump paid $750 in taxes in 2016 and even less in previous years. As I mentioned, you've been reporting on Trump's taxes for decades now. In what ways does the New York Times coverage line up with what you've already been reporting?
Oh, it's confirmed everything in substance that I've been saying for a long time. This has actually been, compared to 2016, when I couldn't get people to listen to me very much, a nice couple of weeks, because the insider books that have come out, the outsider books like Bob Woodward's, have just verified stuff I reported years ago. And in the case of Trump's taxes, he suffered a serious reversal on Wednesday when the Court of Appeals said, nah, you don't have a case, and that his tax and accounting records should be turned over by the Mazars firm to the grand jury in New York. So we're getting much, much closer now to Donald Trump's inevitable indictment and trial.
You know, a couple of takeaways from this, the way we see it, David. And one is that Trump is hardly the businessman he claims to be. And another is that he is flat out a tax cheat. Which of those two takeaways is more important when we think about Trump, the president?
Well, I actually think they're both totally interrelated. Business people create wealth. That's why they start a business, men and women, and they are seeking to improve their economics, not to just spend more money. Donald's like a kid who has a dollar bill burning a hole in his pocket. And as fast as the money comes in, it flows out. He has never in any of his businesses, with the single exception of Trump University, had a dollar invested. He always borrows all the money for a business and takes a fee off the top, or he gets a partner to pay him a fee up front. So he has a negative investment. As for the tax cheating, this is consistent with his lifelong pattern. 4 years ago, I broke the story that to this day, the only major newspaper to mention it is the LA Times in an op-ed I wrote at the beginning of October. And one passing line in the styles section of all places, the marriage announcement section, or as we call it in my household, mergers and acquisitions section of the New York Times, it gave a passing mention to it that Donald Trump was tried twice for tax fraud. It was civil tax fraud, not criminal. And in that case, his own witness, his own longtime tax lawyer and tax accountant, Jack Mitnick, testified that Donald Trump was a forger. He was shown the tax return and evidence, and Jack looked at it and he said, "That's my signature. but I did not sign nor prepare that tax return. And Trump was lucky he wasn't immediately referred for criminal prosecution. By the way, in that case, he did what the Times has shown he did again. He claimed $600,000 of deductions. He had no receipts and no records of any kind. And yet he insisted and went to trial that he was entitled to deduct $600,000 against a business that had revenue of $0 .
Well, and as you bring that part up, and this is also a story about a tax system that works for rich people and seldomly doesn't go as well for everybody else, or usually doesn't go as well for everyone else. What are some of the most egregious aspects of our current tax code that allow a man such as Donald Trump to pay less taxes than, say, a teacher, a nurse, or a firefighter?
Well, America has two income tax systems, separate and unequal. The vast majority of us who get a paycheck are not trusted by our Congress, both parties. So our taxes are taken out before we get our money. Almost nobody can itemize deductions anymore, like gifts to charity, except very wealthy people. And so we're in a system where we will be fully taxed. The other system is for people who own businesses, private businesses. Donald Trump fits this to a T. And Congress trusts these people completely that they will faithfully report their income. They will only take the deductions Congress has authorized, and they will pay every penny of tax that's owed. And the only risk they run is that they will be audited. Well, the odds of that have been falling and falling and falling. And now, for people who make incomes of $1 million and up, and remember, we have people in America now who make in income more than $1 billion a year. Their odds of being audited are less than 1 in 33. And the chance of being tried and convicted, well, in the entire United States last year, there were 530 tax fraud convictions. And most of those people were drug dealers and politicians who took bribes. So that's the system is just totally out of whack. And we, as voters, allowed this. We elected people in both parties who did this to us. And so it is not the job of anybody except us to fix this. And when I say that, I get kickback. People write me notes. It's not my fault. Nonsense. It is your fault. And it's your fault, even if you voted for the people who wanted to do the right thing, because we need to spend time and money and effort to get rid of all the people who are doing bad things. But most importantly, the campaign finance system that totally corrupts our elected officials and forces them to kowtow to this very narrow group of very wealthy people, many of whom, not all, don't want to pay any taxes. They want you and I to subsidize them.
You recently wrote an op-ed for the LA Times that focused on how the IRS is enforcing, or in many cases, failing to enforce its own tax laws. So how is this happening? And obviously, I think we know who's benefiting from this trend.
Right. Well, first of all, what we've done is we defunded the tax police. That's what the IRS are. They're the tax police. And they're just the people carrying out the rules. They're no different than the blue suits on the street. It is Congress that set these rules in place that favor very rich people and allow multinational corporations to make a profit off the income tax system. Many of them literally do that. And the IRS now is so defunded that in 2014, 15, and 16, 3-year period, almost 300,000 people a year who had a high income, $200,000 or more, didn't even file a tax return. Well, Congress has so defunded the IRS that they're not even trying to pursue more than 500,000 of these rich people who aren't filing a tax return. This is just beyond belief. Now, where has that been reported? DC Report. My piece for the LA Times op-ed. Nowhere else. It's not in the New York Times. I offered them a piece about it. I used to work there for many years. It's not in the Washington Post. It's not in the Wall Street Journal. It's not on the nightly news. It's not on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. And people don't know about it. And this is one of the fundamental problems in our country today is we're busy covering the palace intrigues and things, but we're not covering as journalists our government.
Mm-hmm. Again, we're speaking to David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service DC Report, and talking a little bit about his most recent book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And again, I'll point out, David is not a Democrat or a Republican. He is a nonpartisan author and writer and joins us in that capacity today. Another thing we learned from that New York Times story, David, is that Trump is deeply in debt. Many have identified that as a national security issue. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, Donald's total debt is over $1 billion. We don't know who all of that is owed to because the disclosure laws that apply to presidents have big loopholes in them. And that's another thing we need to fix. But here's the real problem. We know that Donald owes more than $300 to Deutsche Bank, an organization that I've said from an American point of view is a criminal organization with an American banking license. It is the favorite bank for Russian criminals, the oligarchs, to launder money. And it's very likely that Deutsche Bank has not made loans to Donald Trump. More likely, Russian criminals put up deposits at the bank to guarantee the loans made to Trump. I mean, imagine, for example, your grown child goes to the bank and says, I want to borrow $100,000 to start some business. And they go, you're not credit worthy. So you, having prospered, go to the bank and say, tell you what, I'll put up $100,000. If my kid doesn't pay, you can take it. And now you've both hidden your role and relieved yourself of the fight with the kid if they don't pay you back, because it's the bank that'll go after them. And there's very good reason to believe that's what's happened with Trump, why Deutsche Bank made these loans. And if that's true, then Donald Trump absolutely is under the thumb of the biggest, best funded criminal gang in the world, the people who stole the wealth of the old Soviet Union, Putin and his gang, the oligarchs.
I'm just left shaking my head. It's just, I mean, it's crazy to even think about this. All right, let's turn to your most recent book. It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America is the title. You wrote that book over 2 years ago. Is it your sense that the nation is more aware now than it was then of the impact of the Trump presidency?
Well, I think there are more people who are waking up to this, but let's not miss the fact that Trump has incredibly solid support somewhere in the 30% of the country. His total support's in the low 40s. But there are tens of millions of Americans who, first of all, have real legitimate economic grievances. And I wrote a series of books, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and the Fine Print, about how the 90% have had their pockets picked by government on behalf of the rich over the last 40 years, starting with Reagan. That's a big group. Overlapping that group of people with economic grievances are people who hate the civil rights movement. They don't want to sit next to a Latino on an airplane. They don't want to have a black pilot in the cockpit. And God forbid they report to a black woman boss. That would just be the end of it. And those are the people who go around, denouncing political correctness, meaning I want the right to use racial and ethnic slurs against people I don't like. And then the third group are these faux Christians who have no idea what's in the Bible, who think that Donald Trump was sent by God, and who believe that God intends for you to be rich and to heck with everybody else. When at least my deep study of these matters over my lifetime is God wants you to prosper if you believe in God, but the greater your wealth, the greater your duty to care for the poor, not to hold them in contempt. And care for doesn't mean to say some nice words. It means to sacrifice.
I grew up going to a Catholic school, and we learned none of what I hear that comes out of Trump's mouth and a lot of this base where they have these attitudes. And in fact, we were taught quite the opposite. And it's one of those things where you always hear these, what would Jesus do? He wouldn't do any of these things. At least that's how I learned it.
And Jim, in my previous book, my Trump biography, The Making of Donald Trump, which goes into his deep entanglements with an international drug trafficker and other things, I quote from a book where he spent 16 pages denouncing Christianity. He calls Christians fools, idiots, and schmucks, not only in that book, but in some speeches that he gave. He says his life philosophy is one word: revenge. If there is anything the New Testament of the Bible completely and totally rejects, it is revenge. And he says that what gives him pleasure in life is destroying the lives of other people. And he goes on and on about how good he felt as he destroyed the life of a woman who wouldn't do a simple, unethical favor for him by making a phone call. And yet Christians embrace this man who is completely against their belief. And the pastors who are telling this to their flocks, they're not Christians. They are deceivers. There's a lot of discussion about deceivers in the Bible, and that you're not supposed to be an idiot and just assume whatever some person who says they're religious tells you. You're supposed to use some judgment. Now, to be clear, I'm a non-believer, but I've studied these matters. I've been a consultant to several mainstream churches. I've actually been paid to give sermons, even though I'm a non-believer, because of people's understanding of my views on morals and ethics.
Before we let you go, should Donald Trump get fired, so to speak, from his current job? And kind of as a second part to that, how hard will it be to undo some of the damage that this administration has caused?
Really important questions, Jim. I wrote a piece of DC Report last week saying we want Donald Trump to live, not just because it's immoral to wish he would die and is bad for us to think that of anyone, no matter who they are, but because we need a clean referendum rejecting Trumpism. If Donald dies before November 3rd, we will not have a clean referendum, and it will haunt our democracy forever. So that's one part of it. Secondly, I do want him to suffer for the things that he's done, and I want to see that he is tried and, if convicted, sentenced to prison. Now, as an old man, he may persuade a judge he shouldn't go to prison. Fine, put him under house arrest. But I want him to suffer for the wrongs that he's done and be a convicted felon. As for the damage that's been done, some of it is unrepairable. I've written about how at the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, where we have millions and millions of highly detailed records of what's called point source solution. These toxics came out of this pipe or smokestack on this date. Those have been compromised, and they may not be usable in the future in court. That is yet to be seen, but I suspect any defendant will attack the legitimacy of those records. They have been destroying records. Trump tears up pieces of paper every day, which is a criminal violation of American law. And they fail to keep records. Jared Kushner, who I think we're going to find out was deeply entangled in the arrest and torture of rich Saudis to pay more money over to the royals, and perhaps even with the death of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. After this is over, we know that they're not following the law on records and things. But the damage in many cases is repairable. It will take a long time. Here's what I hope Joe Biden does, assuming he wins, and that is far from certain, because he can lose the Electoral College even if he wins the popular vote by 20 million votes. I think on November 5th, 6th, 7th, he should announce that if you are in the Trump administration and you committed any crimes, and you come forward, you present all the documents that you have, and you agree to testify, we won't put you in prison. If you don't step forward, we will find you, we will prosecute you, and we will seek the highest, longest prison sentence under the well-established federal government theory of what's called general deterrence. We want to deter anybody else in the future from your behavior. I hope he does that, but it's the tendency of presidents to say, let bygones be bygones. Obama did that when he didn't go after the corrupt bankers. And I've written a lot about that. I mean, it got to the point where Eric Holder for 10 months lied about what was going on, and I proved he was lying. And to me, lying means I got to prove he knew otherwise than what he said. But it remains to be seen. We can recover from this, but it will not be fast. Our institutions are damaged. We've lost a lot of diplomatic, scientific personnel who we have invested a fortune in. I hope that the Biden administration, if there is one, invites many of these people to return to the government and to continue doing public service. And then I hope that we get away from this nonsense notion that everything in politics is corrupt, that the people who work for the government are all in a gravy train, and respect people who dedicate their lives to public service, whether they're school teachers, nurses, or senior scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency.
David K. Johnston, a nonpartisan Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service DC Report, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. If you haven't had a chance to check out this latest book, It's Even Worse Than You Think: What the Trump Administration is Doing to America, I encourage you to do so. David, as always, we enjoy speaking with you today and would love to have you back again soon.
Happy to do so. Take care.
You too as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
For many people, the animals they adopt and love become more like family members than pets. We have deep relationships with cats, dogs, parrots, goats, horses, and other fellow critters who at least pretend to love us back, providing comfort and joy all around. Sadly, though, life for all of us animals is a spin around the wheel of fortune, so illness and injuries happen. That's why one of the most valued members of every community are the staffers in our local veterinarian offices. Practically all vets, nurses, technicians, and support staff are there chiefly because they love animals and get personal satisfaction from providing care for them. When I say they are there, I not only mean 9 to 5, but this group of independent health providers are committed to being there when needed, including off hours and days off, for animal misfortune and suffering don't go by clocks and calendars. Local practitioners also try to be there for low-income people, offering deferred payment plans and even discounted fees so their animals can get the treatment they need. But wait, sound the ambulance sirens. Something is going horribly wrong. This venerable profession has recently been collapsing into a corporate model of Wall Street-owned chains. They are monopolizing markets, reducing staff, gutting service, and prioritizing the love of money over the love of animals. It's not uncommon these days for frantically worried customers to bring an ill or injured pet into their old reliable vet office, only to find it has quietly come under chain ownership, is understaffed, and is unwilling to accept the patient, forcing a desperate scramble to find emergency care, often out of town. This is Jim Hightower saying the same profiteering corporate mentality that has proven disastrous for human health care is now rapidly locking down pet care, and that's an act of animal cruelty.
If you'd like more
Hightower
Jim
Radio
Hightower's
Lowdown
real
is brought to you by
check
the
out
Lowdown
Hightower
Happy
Lowdown.
Hour,
Jim's monthly
live
newsletter gives you the
streamed
real
from the
lowdown
Chat
on
and
which
Chew Cafe.
corporations, by
Details
name,
at
are doing what to the middle class,
HightowerLowdown.org.
our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Emmanuel Saez, who's the director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California at Berkeley. He is currently editor of the Journal of Public Economics and co-director of the Public Policy Program at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. He's also the co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Emmanuel Saez, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Very happy to be here with you today.
And our pleasure to be speaking with you today as well. You've written this book at a unique moment in American history. Income inequality is at the highest level ever recorded. And there, of course, are a lot of numbers that we could use to illustrate this, but what is the most powerful way to convey inequality today?
So I think that the most powerful way to see this is to realize that the economy is not working for the bottom half of the population. So when we crunched the numbers, we saw that in spite of macroeconomic growth, that is on average incomes have grown 60% since 1980, for the bottom half of the population on a pre-tax basis, their incomes have pretty much stagnated. So that's the most striking fact. An economy that doesn't work for half the country is just not on a sustainable path. And the fact that incomes are not growing at the bottom means that incomes are growing disproportionately at the top, with the share of income going to the top 1%, doubling from 10% in 1980 to about 20% today.
Well, and there's something else that you note, that in 2018, the ultra-rich paid a smaller portion of their income in taxes than average Americans. Give us a sense of that disparity.
Yes, so we crunched the numbers in our book, where we computed taxes relative to income by income group. And we included not only taxes at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And so when you pile up all the taxes, you realize that the U.S. tax system is not nearly as progressive as you might think. That is, the low-income folks pay a significant share of their income, about 25% in taxes, that it increases all the way to the middle class and the upper middle class to about 30%. And then what's very striking is that at the very top, when you're thinking really the billionaire class, the tax rates are falling. And so we've estimated that in 2018, the tax rate paid by the top 400 is 23%, lower than for any other income group.
Wow. You mentioned the progressive tax system, and I want to talk to you more about that. But before we do that, I want to point out that part of this book is the history of how we got here. And you make it clear that our tax system today is a result of clear decisions made by lawmakers. What are some of the most significant decisions?
Yes. So the U.S. is the country that invented very progressive taxation in the first part of the 20th century. And for a long time, up to the 1970s, the U.S. had probably the most progressive tax system in the world, where the rich and the ultra-rich were paying much, much higher rates than the average. Now, what happened is that around 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan, the view changed about whether the rich should contribute more, to the public good. The government was seen as a problem. And so what the Reagan administration did is that it stopped essentially enforcing taxes on the very rich, so that a number of tax avoidance, tax evasion strategies developed. And then a few years later, the Reagan administration turned around and told the Democrats, look, taxing the rich doesn't work anymore, and therefore it doesn't make sense to have those high nominal rates on paper. Let's cut taxes and close loopholes, and that's how the tax progressivity was undermined, and that phenomenon was repeated for the corporate tax in very recent years. That the Trump administration cut the corporate tax from 35% to 21% in 2018. So the strategy to undermine tax progressivity is to first let tax avoidance evasion fester, and then say it's impossible to tax the rich, so we have to cut their tax rates.
Now, with your work, help us to understand these decisions. Is it that politicians are beholden to the wealthy contributors who get them elected, or is it more that they actually believe that the way taxes are now structured is best for our country?
I think it's a mix of both. That is, you have powerful private interests, wealthy contributors who don't want a wealth tax, don't want a very progressive income tax, big businesses who don't want a corporate tax, that are going to use their economic power to influence politicians, and more broadly society. And the way they do it is to influence society is also by developing think tanks who are going to build ideas, ways of seeing the world where the story is that taxes on the rich are bad for the economy, and everybody would benefit from having lower taxes on the rich. And here I should say that economists have played a key role in really disseminating that view that taxing the rich has become impossible, that taxing big corporations is bad for economic growth.
We're speaking with Emmanuel Saez, director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of Berkeley, or University of California at Berkeley, currently the editor of the Journal of Public Economics, co-director of the Public Policy Program at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, and co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. A few moments ago, Emmanuel, we talked about the progressive tax system, and most Americans would say that we still have a progressive tax system, but your work established that as more myth than fact. So what are most of us missing?
That is, people typically, when they think about taxes, think about the individual income tax because they file a tax return every year. And it is true that individual income tax is actually progressive in the sense that bottom income earners typically don't owe any individual income tax. And the tax rate as a fraction of income increases at the top. So what this misses, though, is two things. First, there are many other taxes than the individual income tax, and in particular, there are payroll taxes that start on the first dollar of earnings, about 15%, and there are also sales and excise taxes, primarily at the state and local level, that you have to pay on any good you purchase, and that hit the poor who spend their full incomes on consumption, that cannot afford to save much harder than the rich. So overall, when you pile them up, as I said before, the system is kind of only very mildly progressive. And then at the very top, the reason why the individual income tax fails, it's because it is based only on realized income. Now, if you're a multi-billionaire, like take the example of Warren Buffett, who's disclosed the numbers, you have $65 billion in wealth through, shares of your company, Berkshire Hathaway. So Berkshire Hathaway makes a lot of profits. You will pay some corporate taxes on those profits, not that much anymore, but then if the company doesn't distribute you dividends, and if you don't sell your shares, you effectively don't have to realize income, and therefore you don't pay individual income tax. And indeed, with a wealth of $65 billion, the corresponding income is like 5% of that, so maybe $3 billion, and yet Warren Buffett disclosed that his reported income on his individual income tax return was only about 10 to 20 million, which is orders of magnitude smaller than his true economic income because he can keep his profits inside the corporation. And that's why the tax rate at the very top is lower.
It's stunning to hear those numbers as you speak about them. And I think people sometimes get lost in the fact that we're talking millions. Oh, he paid millions of dollars of taxes, but based on the fact that it was on billions of dollars of income, it's a very different story. So let's now talk about solutions. You argue for a far more progressive tax system than what we have now. What are some of the concrete policies that would accomplish this?
Yes, so the main point we make in the book for the people to understand is that tax progressivity is possible if we want it, and it has happened in the historical record as I described earlier, and we could do it again. That is, globalization, technological progress don't impede the development of tax progressivity. You just have to adapt to the modern world, refine the tools, adapt the tax tools, and make tax progressivity work. So the concrete policies that we describe in the book is the wealth tax that we can discuss in more detail in a minute, and fixing the corporate tax. That is, currently multinationals can essentially avoid most of the corporate tax by parking their profits in tax havens because we let them do it. There are simple ways that we could impose taxes on multinationals based on their global profits, regardless of where they report those profits, and that effectively would allow to fix the corporate income tax. So those are the two main examples we discuss in the book.
Well, you mentioned the wealth tax. I guess it is a central part of your thinking. How would it work?
So a wealth tax is a tax that is based on the total wealth, the sum of assets net of debts that a family has. And so the wealth tax, as they've been proposed by candidates, is to apply it only on very wealthy families, so above 50 million in the case of the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax proposal. So it's really a tax that targets the super wealthy, and the tax would be a couple percent above 50 million, perhaps with some graduation for billionaires. So it's obviously a tax that hits only the wealthy, and that's very clear to everybody. You don't need to be an expert to understand that the tax is going to hit the wealthy. And second, it is the most powerful tool to really restore tax progressivity, because at the very top of the income distribution, most of the income comes from wealth. So there is a lot of wealth there, and the wealth is there independently of how you realize income. So if you put a wealth tax, say, of 2%, and if Warren Buffett has a wealth of, say, 65 billion, he would have to pay 2% of that, which is something like already, more than 1 billion in taxes. That is orders of magnitude what he pays for the income tax.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there are arguments, and one of the arguments against your proposals is that greater taxes on wealth would be difficult to enforce, and it would invite evasion. How do you respond to that?
Yes, so this is indeed a very important question, and it's true that if you look at the experience of European countries who've had wealth taxes there have mostly failed. Either they didn't raise that much revenue, or they were totally abandoned, that is, repealed. Our response is that whether a wealth tax will work or not is going to depend on how it is designed and how it is enforced. So to take just a simple example, say in France that just abolished its wealth tax 2 years ago, it was very easy to avoid it, because if you move to London, after 1 year, you were no longer liable for the French wealth tax. In contrast, the U.S. has a tax system based on citizenship. That is, as long as you remain a U.S. citizen, you have to pay the wealth tax, the U.S. wealth tax, no matter where you live. And even if you renounce your citizenship, you would have to face a very strong exit tax. Europe was also very weak at enforcing the tax with regard, to offshore tax evasion. It was very easy for the French to put their money in Swiss bank accounts, and Switzerland didn't report anything to French authorities. The U.S. has cracked down a lot on offshore tax evasion, actually under the Obama administration, by passing a law, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, that requires any foreign financial institution to report accounts held by U.S. Residents to the IRS under a strong penalty. So all that shows you that those aspects are going to be critical in making the wealth tax work, and we think that if it is well designed, it could work. And that's why actually it's scaring so much, billionaires and many people on the right. If they thought this wealth tax is going to be a nothing burger, they wouldn't be so worried about it. But the fact that they are so worried tells you that if done well, it can really make a difference.
Yeah, if they're talking about it, they're definitely nervous about it. That's for sure. Before we let you go, candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have integrated some of your ideas into their campaign platforms. Some may view that as a risky political move on their part. To what extent do you believe American voters are ready for an overhaul of our tax policy?
I think American voters perceive that the system doesn't work, especially for bottom-income earners. The expression is that the system is rigged. So they have a sense that the economy is not working, and they are looking for solutions. And actually, when you poll voters, taxing the rich more is very popular. And in particular, the wealth tax hitting the rich is popular. Even a majority of Republicans voters think that would be a good idea. So actually, if you look at how the primary has unfolded, when Elizabeth Warren proposed her wealth tax in January, it certainly gave a big boost to her campaign, because for the first time that was a tax policy that was clear, very easy to understand, where the goal and the means were really well aligned and easy for everybody to grasp. So I think there is a real demand for more tax progressivity, and indeed in this campaign you are seeing candidates, so Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren certainly, but also Mayor Pete to some extent, proposing tax platforms that are much more progressive than what we've seen from major candidates in decades.
It will be interesting to see what happens in 2020 and beyond, certainly. Emmanuel Saez, the director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California at Berkeley, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. He is co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Emmanuel, we very much appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back and talk some more about it sometime in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
We meet on a very important day, the United Nations saying that we don't have to wait to see what the impact of the war in Ukraine is going to be around the world, that we're already seeing it. The Secretary General says it's a three-part catastrophe, really having an impact on food and energy and money around the world. How bad is it?
It's just as bad as the Secretary General said and intimated, and in my mind, having seen a lot of it on the ground, I think it could possibly be worse. We're faced with a situation. Ukraine is and was the breadbasket of Europe and a good portion of the world. And our emergency foodstuffs were coming primarily out of Ukraine and somewhat out of Russia. And so now with Ukraine, the inability for Ukraine to produce, and with Russia being what they are now, being cut off from the world, basically, we're faced with now having to take food from hungry children to give it to starving children. And we've cut food rations. There's a lot going on, and we can get into that. But this is a very serious situation, and this has a ripple effect that goes around the world.
So much beyond Ukraine, as bad as it is in Ukraine, and I guess much beyond Russia, because it must be impacting Russia as well. Are there any particular areas of the world that?
Well, I'll start with Africa, and we have issues with Madagascar, Kenya, the Sahel. These are regions that are seriously affected by climate change as well as instability, and so combined, there's an inability in many cases to grow food, and there's an inability to have any water to grow it with. So I mean, it's a combination of things. And so what World Food Program does and what other agencies do is to provide emergency sustenance for these folks. And we've already cut rations. We're going to have to cut them more. And that will not only have a ripple effect immediately on the ground, but for generations to come.
And part of that is because, I guess the question is, Ukraine and Russia both, a big supplier of wheat particularly and barley, and those exports are needed.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
For other countries.
Right.
And these are people that are already having serious problems, right? This is not new to them, already living.
Yeah.
And you've seen that in poverty.
Malnutrition, all the things that we see, our inability through World Food Program to produce the highly nutritious paste that we give our infants and our young children especially as well.
Is this impacting food prices?
Oh,
as well?
Most definitely. We're seeing it in the United States as well as around the world. I mean, other countries are seeing it just as hard as we are, and it's going to get worse. It won't get any better right away. But let me say, Ukraine had the crops in the ground. Ukraine, they're mass producers of incredible foodstuffs. And because of this war and because of their inability to, number one, harvest the grain because there are landmines in the ground, the equipment is mined, the roads are mined, the inability to move, if they could harvest, to get it out of there it's non-existent. They can't use rail. The roads are unsafe. You know all the stories. We've all read what's going on. And with all of that said, so it's a catastrophic and cataclysmic event within food, as you said, with economy and with gas and oil.
So how long will it take for them to recover?
Oh, years. I don't see this with the damage that has been done and is being done on a daily basis. We don't see this recovering anytime soon. Even if the war were to stop right this moment, it would be years before we could get back.
And is there anything in the short term that the United Nations or the United States can do?
Oh, yes. No, the United States, as you know, the United States is the largest donor to the food and agriculture agencies that I deal with here in the world. We're number one. And on top of that, with the most recent donation of $1 billion by the Biden administration for humanitarian efforts combined. These are all, we're very involved in this, and we always have been, but now we're involved even more because of just the actions and the implication of what's going on the ground.
Right. Now, this comes on top of the work that the UN agencies for food and agriculture were already doing. Yeah. Around the world, which I think most Americans, including yours truly, don't really know a lot about. Yeah. This is a major focus for the United Nations.
It is.
And how many people are we talking about around the world?
Oh, my gosh.
How many countries that really where
that are in food insecurity,
Yes.
hundreds of millions
Really?
right now. Because it when we say food insecure, we have to remember that there are a lot of reasons why people are food insecure, not just war. Climate change, as I mentioned, water resources, water management, which is a huge issue with me. I mean, I come from an area where we count the drops.
Yeah.
So water is one of my focuses. All of those things combined, and we have our emergency abilities through World Food Program that's being cut now because we don't have the grain and the supplies. And also our agencies like FAO, EFAD, our ICROM. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do in these agencies here, and I know those are acronyms, and I can give you the rundown on them. But all of those things come into play when we're talking about food insecurity and the ability to sustain food as well. And the FAO deals primarily with sustainability and long-term effects of what's happening right now.
And the FAO is?
FAO is Food and Agriculture Organization, and they're based here in Rome, obviously. All these are Rome agencies that I'm talking about.
And one of the agencies that you're ambassador to?
All of them.
All of them?
Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
I got to give my credentials 6 different times. It was fun.
Oh. So 6 different agencies?
6 different agencies. It was fun.
You have 6 different hats?
Exactly.
But, it's just, of course, we're in Rome, where people are living the good life. In the United States, we're living this good life. And basically, most of us have 3 solid meals a day. Mm-hmm. There's such people, I think, don't comprehend how many millions of people live on the edge.
Right on the edge. And it's more than you would think. When you start talking about one of the places in Madagascar that I was, and I'd never been to I've been around the world. I'd never been to Madagascar. It's hard to get to. Let me tell you also. But one of the things that occurred to me, that happened to me, that I've been in situations like this before, but this has never actually happened to me, where mothers would come up to me begging me for food.
Wow.
I mean, it has not just an impact on me, but this is not uncommon around the world now. People don't have food. And of course, it's always the most vulnerable are women and children that get hit first by it and suffer the long-term effects of what food insecurity is doing to not just them personally, but to their communities and to their countries.
Is this a program that has the support, first of all, of the United States,
Yes.
correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Strong support.
Strong support. Again, largest donors.
Mm-hmm. Other countries as well?
Yes, we do. We have Germany's a huge donor. Canada, of course. Australia is here. UK is here. I mean, the usual suspects, and I mean that in the kindest way. And also a lot of countries that you wouldn't suspect or you would think would be too small to participate in a major way. And so this is not for lack of caring. I know some people think, well, people just don't care, and countries, they've got other things going on. That's not the case. But it is such a huge problem that if we don't work on this together, then we're not going to be able to fix any of it. Part of all this is down, on the long-term effect is using science and technology to grow more with less. To use, again, water management that I mentioned, seeds, producing seeds that can be more prosperous in their growth once they're planted, and having more seeds also. Seed vaults have become very important to me. And now the seed vaults around the world.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.